Have you ever wondered why some war movies from the swinging 60s vanished from theaters almost as quickly as they appeared? Films that dared to question authority, expose uncomfortable truths, or paint war in a light too real for audiences of the time. These weren't just movies. They were cinematic grenades, pulled before they could explode on the big screen. Stay close, because we're about to unlock the hidden reels of 10 censored war films of the 1960s that history tried to bury. The War Game, 1966. Picture it. Britain in the mid-60s, an age of optimism, the Beatles topping charts, and color television just finding its way into homes. Yet behind that bright facade lurked the ever-present shadow of the Cold War. Filmmaker Peter Watkins tapped into that fear with a film so realistic it shook even those who commissioned it. The War Game wasn't a glossy Hollywood drama. It was shot like a documentary, raw and unflinching, showing what might happen if nuclear conflict struck Britain. Not soldiers charging into battlefields, but ordinary families, panicked faces, desperate crowds, silence where laughter once lived. It was a chilling mirror held up to society. So why was it pulled? The BBC had originally planned to air it nationwide. Imagine millions of viewers, families gathered around the television, suddenly staring into a nightmare that felt all too possible. But before its broadcast date, higher-ups decided it was simply too frightening, too real. They shelved it, declaring that British audiences were not ready for such imagery. Yet here's the twist. While banned from television, The War Game did sneak into select cinemas and festivals, even winning an Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature. A film both banned and celebrated at the same time. How's that for irony? Did you know? For nearly 20 years, ordinary British households never saw it on their screens. It wasn't until 1985, long after its creation, that the BBC finally aired the film. By then, the Cold War tension had shifted, but its power remained. The War Game set the tone for what 60s censorship really meant, not just keeping films from audiences, but controlling the very stories people were allowed to imagine. And this was only the beginning. Other films would meet the same fate, each for reasons just as explosive. The Battle of Algiers, 1966. Now, this wasn't your typical war spectacle filled with marching bands and polished uniforms. No, this was gritty, unvarnished, and shot with a realism that made audiences forget they were watching actors at all. Directed by Gillo Pontecorvo, it told the story of Algeria's fight for independence against French colonial rule. What made it revolutionary wasn't just the subject, it was the style. Shot in black and white, using non-professional actors, it looked like raw newsreel footage straight from the streets. And that's exactly why it sent shockwaves. The film didn't glorify one side. It laid bare the brutal chess match between occupiers and insurgents. Every bombing, every confrontation, it was captured with a cold precision that audiences found hauntingly authentic. So authentic, in fact, that many viewers thought they were watching actual documentary footage. But France wasn't having it. The wounds of the Algerian War were still fresh, and this film reopened them in full color. Well, in full black and white. Officials feared that its release would fuel unrest, spark protests, and force the public to confront a history many wanted quietly swept under the rug. The result? A ban. French theaters couldn't show it for years. The Battle of Algiers was effectively silenced in the very country whose story it dared to tell. Imagine. A masterpiece praised worldwide, winning the Golden Lion at Venice, influencing filmmakers from Francis Ford Coppola to Spike Lee, yet hidden away from the people most connected to it. Here's the kicker. Decades later, military academies around the world, yes, even in the US, used the film as a case study in urban conflict. A film once banned for being too dangerous ended up being studied as a textbook of strategy. Did you know? When it finally resurfaced in France, audiences saw it not just as a movie, but as a time capsule, one that proved cinema could capture history even when governments tried to bury it. If the War Game was banned for being too terrifying, then the Battle of Algiers was banned for being too true. And that truth? It still echoes through film history. The Green Berets, 1968. When John Wayne put his name behind the Green Berets, he wasn't just making a movie, he was making a statement. At a time when most Hollywood studios were steering clear of the Vietnam War, Wayne marched right into the controversy with flags flying. Based loosely on Robin Moore's book, The film painted a picture of U.S. involvement in Vietnam that critics called too polished, too heroic, too out of touch with the reality unfolding on nightly news broadcasts. Did you know some theaters flat out refused to screen it? Cities across America saw protests erupt outside cinemas, and in several European countries, reels were cut or pulled altogether. For a film meant to rally patriotic pride, it instead became a lightning rod, exposing just how divided audiences had become. The censorship wasn't only about politics, it was about tone. Where documentaries were showing mud, chaos, and confusion, the Green Berets delivered John Wayne heroics under Technicolor sunsets. For some, it felt like a recruiting poster rather than a film. And yet, here's the twist. Despite boycotts and bans, audiences still packed theaters, curious to see what the Duke had to say about America's most controversial war. Like Wayne himself, the Green Berets refused to back down. Love it or hate it, it's one of the few 1960s war films to be censored, protested, and yet still cemented as a strange, enduring artifact of Hollywood clashing with history. The Victors, 1963. Carl Foreman's The Victors wasn't your standard rah-rah World War II movie. It was a cold slap of reality. Instead of celebrating heroics, it lingered on the moral gray zones, showing American soldiers caught in moments of cruelty, confusion, and compromise. This was a war film that asked, what happens when the good guys aren't always so good? Audiences weren't ready for it. Did you know that in some European countries, entire reels were cut? In the U.S., theaters trimmed scenes that showed American troops in unflattering light, moments of callousness, even executions, because they clashed with the patriotic image the studios preferred to sell. The film didn't glorify victory, it showed the cost of it, and that was enough to rattle censors. The backlash was swift. Critics praised its daring honesty, but box offices struggled as certain cities quietly dropped it from schedules. The truth was too sharp, too uncomfortable, too un-American for audiences who still wanted their war movies polished and noble. Yet over time, The Victors gained a reputation as one of the boldest war dramas of its era, a film that dared to show the victors not as shining heroes, but as flawed, weary men stumbling through the rubble of a broken Europe. Censored in its own decade, it now plays like a prophecy of the more honest war films to come. The Bedford Incident, 1965. Imagine a Cold War thriller where the enemy isn't the Soviet fleet, it's the pride of one American captain. The Bedford Incident, starring Richard Widmark and Sidney Poitier, told the story of a destroyer crew pushed to the breaking point by a commander obsessed with brinkmanship. The tension built to a climax so shocking that some theaters demanded it be softened, fearing the ending would panic audiences living under the shadow of nuclear war. Censors didn't like the parallels. The message was clear. Reckless leaders could take the world to the edge. In an era when duck and cover drills were still fresh in people's minds, the film hit too close to home. In some regions, the ending was trimmed or altered in marketing campaigns to avoid scaring moviegoers. Critics praised its daring, but audiences were split. Some called it a masterpiece, others refused to sit through what felt like a mirror held too close to real life. The fact that the movie was briefly pulled from some cinemas shows just how sensitive Cold War nerves really were. Today, The Bedford Incident stands as one of the most chilling war-adjacent films of the 60s, proving that sometimes the most dangerous battles don't happen on the ground, but in the minds of the men holding the trigger. Castle Keep, 1969. If most World War II movies of the 1960s felt straightforward, Sidney Pollack's Castle Keep was anything but. Starring Burt Lancaster, the film was surreal, dreamlike, and packed with anti-war satire. Instead of heroes and villains, it gave audiences fractured soldiers holed up in a medieval castle, fighting not just the enemy but the absurdity of their own existence. Censors didn't know what to make of it. Certain scenes were considered too strange, too bleak, too unmarketable for mainstream audiences. The mix of dark comedy, surreal imagery, and brutality got it trimmed in multiple regions, with distributors quietly shelving it in towns that preferred their war movies simple and noble. Did you know? Castle Keep was one of the first Hollywood war films to openly challenge the myth of noble sacrifice, showing instead the futility and chaos of battle. But in 1969, audiences weren't ready. Many walked out confused, and critics were split between calling it brilliant or incomprehensible. Still, Its very strangeness is what makes it legendary now. Castle Keep was censored for daring to show that war, stripped of its slogans, could look like madness itself. The Americanization of Emily, 1964. James Garner and Julie Andrews delivered something audiences weren't expecting in The Americanization of Emily, a war film that openly mocked the idea of glory and questioned the obsession with military heroism. Released at the height of the 1960s, when patriotism still dominated, this razor-sharp satire struck nerves in all the wrong places. Veterans groups protested, and certain theaters refused to show it. Why? Because it dared to say what few films at the time would: that war often rewards death more than life, and that celebrating sacrifice could be dangerous. For a comedy drama dressed in romance, it carried the weight of a hand grenade. Did you know? The studio itself worried about the backlash, toning down marketing campaigns and pushing it less aggressively in conservative regions. It wasn't banned outright, but the pushback was strong enough that its box office numbers were cut short. Over time, critics have hailed it as one of the smartest anti-war films ever made. But in its day, The Americanization of Emily was seen as un-American. Its censorship came not from scissors, but from silence, cinemas and advertisers refusing to give it the spotlight it deserved. Morituri, 60's. Marlon Brando and Yul Brynner on a cargo ship filled with explosives. What could go wrong? Morituri was a tense WWE thriller about sabotage, survival, and trust. But instead of delivering a straightforward wartime adventure, it painted a bleak picture of men trapped by circumstance, loyalty, and fear. The result? Trouble at the box office. Critics praised its craftsmanship, but audiences rejected its unglamorous portrayal of war. In some regions, theaters pulled it early, claiming it was too downbeat to sell tickets. Others trimmed dialogue they considered too sympathetic toward enemy characters. Did you know? Brando himself later admitted the film's reception baffled him because he believed it was one of his strongest performances of the decade. But Hollywood wasn't ready to market a war movie without clear heroes and villains. Over the years, Morituri has gained a cult reputation precisely because it didn't play by the rules. Censored not by governments, but by distributors who didn't know what to do with it, the film stands as one of the lost gems of 60s war cinema. None But the Brave, 1965. Frank Sinatra's only film as a director wasn't a musical, wasn't a comedy. It was a war drama. None But the Brave told the story of American and Japanese soldiers stranded on the same island, forced to work together to survive. It was daring, human, and deeply controversial for one simple reason: it humanized the so-called enemy. In Japan, censors trimmed scenes they felt painted their soldiers too harshly. In the US, certain theaters resisted showing a movie that suggested American and Japanese troops could find common ground. It was too soon, too raw, just 2 decades after the Pacific War had ended. Critics didn't know what to make of it either. Some hailed it as bold, others dismissed it as naive. But the fact remains: None But the Brave was one of the rare American war films of the 60s that dared to imagine compassion on both sides, and it paid the price with censorship and limited distribution. Today, it's remembered as a fascinating anomaly. Sinatra, better known for swinging on stage than directing war dramas, delivered a film so ahead of its time that both censors and audiences didn't know what to do with it. The Battle of Neretva, 1969. This was no small project. Directed by Veljko Bulajic, it was a massive war epic, dramatizing a famous WO2 battle where Yugoslav partisans fought against Axis forces. The scale was staggering: tanks, planes, thousands of extras, and even Pablo Picasso designing the poster. Yes, Picasso himself. The film was released internationally, but here's the twist: distributors in different countries hacked it apart to suit their tastes. In the US, the original 3-hour cut was slashed down by nearly an hour. Dialogue was redubbed, sequences were rearranged, and entire subplots vanished. The result? A fragmented version that stripped away much of the film's cultural identity. Censorship here wasn't political silencing, it was commercial censorship. Studios feared Western audiences wouldn't sit through a long, subtitled war drama, so they trimmed it into something leaner, but also emptier. Critics complained that the international version felt incoherent, a patchwork of battles without the soul of the original. Did you know? In some markets, even the title was changed, with posters and marketing rebranded to emphasize action over authenticity. It was as if distributors wanted the spectacle, but not the message. For Yugoslavia, the Battle of Neretva was a point of national pride. For the rest of the world, it became a victim of the scissors, proof that censorship isn't always about politics. Sometimes it's about underestimating an audience's patience and intelligence. Today, restored versions attempt to bring Bulagic's vision back to life, but the scars of those cuts remain. The film stands as a final reminder. Even the biggest epics of the 60s weren't safe from the blades of censorship. So there it is, war films of the 1960s that didn't just rattle the box office, they rattled the censors. Some were trimmed, some were shelved, and some were nearly buried altogether. But history has a funny way of proving that the reels they tried to hide are the ones we can't stop talking about. Which of these lost or censored films would you dare to watch today? Drop your answer below, hit subscribe, and remember, Hollywood's hidden reels never stay hidden for long.